And I now look to Dr. Reuben Brigety to close the case for the proposition.
Mr. President, honorable members, good evening. It is my great honor to be here with you tonight. I stand before you as a proud American, trained at the United States Naval Academy, confirmed by the United States Senate to serve as President Obama's ambassador to the African Union. I stand before you as an Anglophile, educated in graduate studies here in the UK at Cambridge, steeped in the values of the Western tradition. And I stand before you tonight as a son of Africa, descended from the Yoruba people of modern Nigeria, the progeny of those who survived the Great Middle Passage and Jim Crow law in the American South, and married to a daughter of Ethiopia. It is on the basis of all three of those identities, all three of those perspectives, that I urge you to vote in favor of the motion that this House would embrace an ever closer African Union. Now, having said that, I must say, it is a bit ironic, if not cheeky, for this House to consider a motion about the African Union, as if it were up to this House, or any House outside of Africa, to decide what Africans want for themselves. Asking this House to pass judgment on the future of the African Union is a bit like asking the heads of state in Africa when they meet in Addis Ababa in a fortnight from now to ask their view on the future of Brexit. Nevertheless, honorable members, you have been asked to make a judgment tonight. And so the task that lies before me as the last speaker for the proposition is to show you why, if you are logical and rational, if you have a heart and a sense of history, why the only logical choice for you to make tonight is to vote in favor of the motion and against the opposition. You have heard tonight incredibly impassioned speeches. You heard first from my colleague, the honorable member who made a speech of great erudition about the framework and facts of contemporary Africa and why they lend themselves to a proposition in support of an ever closer African Union. You also heard an impassioned speech from my other colleague with a profound sense of history, not only the historical crimes that have been visited upon the continent, but also why the only way those crimes can be addressed and the only way for there to be an honorable future, again, is to embrace an ever closer African Union. What I shall do with the remaining of my time is to take to task the series of spurious arguments proposed by the opposition. Let us begin with the first speaker, the honorable member from Christchurch, who laid out a great theoretical argument for why you should not support the motion. It was great in theory, and as the French say, of course, it's great in practice, but how does it work in theory? The problem, of course, the series of problems with the opposition's assertions are that indeed they neglect, glide over, or outright ignore many of the facts of contemporary Africa. Let us start from the assertion that the African Union is so full of failures that to embrace an ever closer African Union would, by extension, only serve to embrace an ever closer and greater series of failures. There are two fundamental problems with this assertion. The first is that it overlooks a series of quite substantial achievements by the African Union, led by, I would argue, the brave and incredible sacrifice of African Union troops who've bled and died in Somalia, in Darfur, in the Central African Republic, and in Eastern Congo, under the banner of the AU, trying desperately, in some cases for years, in virtually every circumstance, with the most minimal of resources, to bring peace to a troubled people. And to suggest, particularly in the cases where those peace support missions have been successful, that indeed they are simply one of so many failures, is to blithely, if not callously, overlook the bravery and the sacrifice of these African soldiers. The second fundamental problem is that it suggests that unless the African Union were to live up to the Platonic ideal of itself, that is, to live up to some version of perfection, by definition, it must be rejected. That flies in the face of everything that we understand about evaluating contemporary international organizations and indeed contemporary politics. I would go so far as to submit that if one were to advocate or debate or contemplate whether or not one should embrace parliamentary democracy, one might reasonably take a look at the current state of the British Parliament and reject the notion out of hand. And yet we do not, because we know that on balance, the successes and the contributions, in this case of parliamentary democracy, and also in the broader case of the still quite young African Union, far outweigh the quite important and quite reasonable challenges that it has had over time. The second fundamental problem with the opposition is that they can't seem to get their story straight. On the one hand, you have the first speaker who says that the notion of an ever closer African Union is not only flawed as a perspective of looking empirically at its record, but is flawed more normatively, meaning that even if it were perfect, it shouldn't be done. Because ideologically, it fundamentally undermines the sovereignty of individual African states, and therefore, the notion of a greater sense of unity on the continent should itself be rejected. And then, the second speaker takes the proposition that indeed the reason ever closer African Union ought to be rejected is because it doesn't go far enough. Take the whole loaf, not just the half loaf. We want a fully United States of Africa that completely erases the sovereignty of governments and indeed creates a sovereign continental political identity. The technical term for this approach is to throw the spaghetti up against the wall school debating and see what sticks. Because they can't make up their mind, and if they can't make up their mind amongst themselves, why should you decide to support their proposition? The final, crucially important flaw is that the debate from the perspective of the opposition does not fully embrace the historical significance of the project of African unity. In the spring of 1963, when the founding fathers of Africa, Ben Bella of Algeria, His Imperial Highness Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Sekou Toure of Guinea, came to Addis Ababa, their vision was African unity, not necessarily African unanimity, and it certainly wasn't, let's keep doing what we've been doing, and further atomize ourselves. This is a multi-generational project. And while there might certainly be natural limits to how far it can go, as you're seeing currently right now here in the UK as it relates to European unity, there is no plausible argument that suggests that the African Union is anywhere close to butting up against that natural limit as we stand here today. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage you, using your mind and using your heart, to vote in favor of the motion. This House should embrace an ever closer African Union. Thank you.